Hello, in this video we'll be looking at specialization and trade. We'll be looking at how you can use your comparative advantages to work with other people who are specializing in their comparative advantages, and you'll be able to get to points that are beyond your individual production possibility frontier. Points that would be otherwise unattainable, but through working together, taking advantage of your different opportunity costs, you're able to produce more together than otherwise alone. There are two types of advantages that we're going to discuss: absolute and comparative advantage. Absolute advantage means that an individual or person or country is producing one good more efficiently. So we might think about how long it takes you to do the dishes versus how long it takes your sibling to do the dishes. Maybe it takes you 20 minutes to do the dishes, it takes them 30 minutes to do the dishes. We would say that you have an absolute advantage, you're more efficient, you are better at doing dishes than your sibling. So absolute advantage just means that one country or one person can do a particular good more efficiently than someone else. You can produce a larger quantity of apples than your neighbor. One country can make a lot more chocolate than another country, right? So absolute advantage just means you can make more stuff in the same amount of time. Comparative advantage, though, uses opportunity costs. So it's not about being the biggest, producing the most in a certain amount of time. It's about what you are giving up or not giving up. So whoever is giving up the least of some other type of good should be producing that first good. In this video, we're going to see how we can view this on a graph, how we can calculate it, how we can decide who should specialize, and how countries and individuals should trade with each other to be able to get to points beyond their individual production possibility curve. Comparative advantage means there's a lower implicit cost of production, meaning you have a lower foregone opportunity. It's going to be relatively more efficient when comparing the production of two goods. Generally, when we look at absolute advantage, we're looking at one good at a time. Which person can make the most hats per week? Comparative advantage means we're looking at the production of hats and belts. We have two goods that we're comparing. And it's not just about who can produce more in the same amount of time, but also who's giving up less hats every time they're making a belt, and who is giving up less belts every time they're making a hat. So comparative advantage is relatively more efficient. And it's going to be the basis for trade. You don't have to be the biggest, you don't have to be the fastest. You can actually offer something, contribute, increase total productive capacity when you're specializing in something that you have a lower opportunity cost than someone else. Small countries can participate in trade, they can produce things, they could be on the world stage without having to be the largest producer. They just have to have a lower opportunity cost. Comparative advantages can come from things like natural resources. Some countries have an abundance of a certain type of resource, which means it's going to be easier for them to access it and use it quickly and cheaply. It may be the labor supply. You could have a very large labor supply, lots of workers available. Or human capital, which is the knowledge and skills of workers. Certain countries or certain areas specialize in having certain types of workers or certain industries. Regional climate plays a role. Countries that have warmer climates are able to grow certain types of produce. Other places maybe have more rain, or other types of climates that affect production of many types of goods or other natural resources. Type of government, the infrastructure available in the country also can create comparative advantages for certain industries or types of goods. And when countries and individuals work together, when they specialize in something that they have a comparative advantage in, we're going to end up with gains from specialization, meaning we're able to get to a point beyond our individual production possibility curve. So when should you trade? When should countries trade together? When should individuals trade? You should trade when you have a different opportunity cost than somebody else. If you specialize in your comparative advantage, trade trade with other people doing the same, you're going to get a combined production possibility curve. And after trade, you will be able to have more than had you only worked alone. We can produce more together than any combinations of producing alone. We're going to look at an example over the next couple of slides where you and your neighbor live next to a fruit orchard, and you're able to pick apples and cherries. You each have your own individual production possibility frontiers that show you the maximum that you could each pick by yourself. And we're going to see how you can get to a point after trading, specializing and trading with your neighbor, that's beyond your individual production possibility curve. So in this example, if you worked by yourself, you would pick 15 pounds of apples and 20 pounds of cherries. But after you specialize and trade with your neighbor, you're going to end up with 15 pounds of apples and 25 pounds of cherries. You're going to get extra fruit without having to do any extra work. So let's look at this example here. You and your neighbor live next to a fruit orchard that has apple and cherry trees. You currently each pick fruit for yourselves. You don't work together. You go and you pick your fruit. Your neighbor goes and picks their fruit. So you can pick a maximum of 30 pounds of apples or 40 pounds of cherries each week. This is showing you the end points of your production possibility curve. So if we see this on a graph, we would put apples on the y-axis, cherries on the x-axis. So if you spend all of your time picking apples, we'd put a point right here at 30 apples and 0 cherries. You can also spend all of your time picking cherries, and that would be this point over here, where you're picking 40 cherries and 0 apples. And here what we're going to do is we're going to actually have constant opportunity costs. Earlier in this chapter, you may have read about increasing opportunity costs, where we had that bowed production possibility curve. It was bowed outward. It was curved. To make some of our calculations easier, to get to our end conclusions a little bit quicker, we're going to do constant opportunity costs for these examples where we're doing calculations. This allows us to use algebra, and it makes things a little bit simpler. And since this is a constant opportunity cost, we can actually just draw a straight line between those 2 points. So you can pick 30 apples, 40 cherries, or some combination in between. So if you decided to spend half of your time on apples and half of your time on cherries, you would end up with 15 apples and 20 pounds of cherries. Your neighbor can pick a maximum of 16 pounds of apples or 32 pounds of cherries each week. So same thing, that's showing you the end points of their production possibility curve. They can also produce other combinations in between. So how should you divide up the work to increase your fruit production? How should you work by yourself? Or is it going to be worth your time to work together with your neighbor, specialize in only picking one fruit, and trade with each other? So we're going to draw the production possibility frontier for each person. We're going to calculate the opportunity cost for you and your neighbor. And then we're going to decide if you should specialize and trade. And if you should specialize, what you should specialize in. Okay, so first, we've got your production possibility frontier curve right here. So we've got apples and we have cherries. You can pick 30 pounds of apples or 40 pounds of cherries. Draw a straight line between the 2 points. Your neighbor can pick 16 pounds of apples or 32 pounds of cherries, and then you can draw a line between those 2 points. When we're talking about absolute advantage, who is relatively more efficient when looking at only one good, we look to see who can pick the most fruit per week. So who has the absolute advantage in apples? You do, because you can pick 30 pounds of apples in the same amount of time that your neighbor can pick 16. Who has the absolute advantage in cherries? Also you, because you can pick 40 pounds of cherries in the same amount of time it takes your neighbor to pick 32. So you actually have the absolute advantage in producing both fruit. And you might think to yourself, I'm better at picking apples, I'm better at picking cherries. I shouldn't work with my neighbor. I should just do this by myself because I am better at both tasks. The problem is we've actually ignored the comparative advantage or your opportunity cost, because every time you're picking cherries, you're giving up apples. And every time you're picking up apples, you're giving up cherries. And so what we want to do is we want to calculate you and your neighbor's comparative advantages to see if you can benefit from specializing and trading. Comparative advantage is determined by the opportunity cost of producing one good over another. How many cherries are you giving up when you're picking apples? Whoever has the lowest opportunity cost should pick that fruit. We're not going to be looking at things in terms of dollar value or money. It might be a little bit difficult because you have some internal knowledge maybe of the value of apples or the value of cherries. We're just going to ignore that for now, and we're only going to focus on the value of cherries in terms of how many apples you're giving up. We're going to calculate opportunity cost at the margin, which means we want to know for every 1 pound of apples you're picking, how many pounds of cherries are you giving up? For every 1 pound of apples your neighbor picks, how many pounds of cherries are they giving up? Whoever is giving up less cherries, we're going to say they have the comparative advantage. They have the comparative advantage in apples because it's cheaper in the sense of the less cherries that they're giving up. It's a little bit strange to think of these things in this way because our brains are very used to thinking of things in terms of dollar value. How much is one apple worth? Is it $1? How much is a cherry worth? 50 cents? And so we want to be comparing things with prices. So you're going to have to try to unlearn what you know, create a new mental model where we're valuing items in terms of another item or thing that we're not producing during that time. There are some extra try it examples on pages 52 and 64 of your textbook if you would like to do some more practice examples. So let me show you how to calculate opportunity cost. We're going to do this for both you and your neighbor. So you can pick 30 pounds of apples or 40 pounds of cherries in the same amount of time. We're going to put these two numbers equal to each other because they have the same time value. They're equal in terms of time. We want to calculate this at the margin, and so we want to know your opportunity cost for every 1 pound of apples. And so we're going to divide both sides of our equation by 30 because this is going to tell us the value of 1 pound of apples. So for you, every time you are picking 1 pound of apples, your opportunity cost is going to be 1 1/3 pounds of cherries. So your cost of apples is the cherries that you're not picking. We want to do the same thing for your neighbor. Your neighbor can pick 16 pounds of apples or 32 pounds of cherries in 1 week. We're going to set these two numbers equal to each other because they both represent the same time value. We want to know their opportunity cost at the margin as well. And so we're going to divide both sides by 16 to tell us their opportunity cost for every 1 pound of apples. So your neighbor, every time they're picking 1 pound of apples, their cost is the 2 pounds of cherries they're not picking at. When you look at these two numbers, we're trying to figure out who is more efficient at picking apples. We want to choose the person who's giving up less cherries, or the number on the right-hand side of the equation. So when we're comparing 1/3 to 2, we would say that 1 1/3 is lower. And so you actually have the lower opportunity cost of picking apples. So lower opportunity cost of apples. Because your cost in terms of cherries that you're giving up is less. So we would say that you have a comparative advantage in apples. Then we want to calculate your opportunity costs for cherries. And so we do the same thing, but put the numbers on the opposite side of the equation. So we'd say you can pick 40 pounds of cherries or 30 pounds of apples. We're going to set those two things equal to each other because they have the same time value. And then because we want to know your opportunity cost for every 1 pound of cherries, we're going to divide both sides by 40. So for you, for every 1 pound of cherries, you're giving up 3/4 or 0.75 pounds of apples. And then we want to calculate your neighbor's opportunity cost. So we would say they can do 32 pounds of cherries or 16 pounds of apples. We're going to set those two things equal to each other because they represent the same time value. Then we're going to divide both sides by 32 so that we can see your neighbor's opportunity cost for 1 pound of cherries. So for every pound of cherries they're picking, their opportunity cost is 1/2 or 0.5 pounds of apples that they're not picking during that time. So who has the lower opportunity cost of cherries? Your neighbor does, because 1/2 is less than 3/4. So we would say that your neighbor actually has the comparative advantage in picking cherries. So because you have different comparative advantages, you should specialize and trade with your neighbor. You can actually end up with more fruit doing this than working by yourself, even though you have an absolute advantage in both fruits. So you specialize in apples, your neighbor should specialize in cherries. So neighbor, cherries. And then you should pick only apples. Okay, so let's see how this works, how you actually end up with more fruit doing this. Okay, so here's just the chart showing the answers that we calculated on the last slide. Okay, so I need to give you a little bit more information. So I have to give you the amount that each person would pick by themselves. This is actually based on individual preferences and utility functions, something that we haven't covered yet. So this information will be given to you. The combination that they would choose by themselves. I'm also going to have to tell you the trade rate. So this information will also be given. This is something that's also based on utility and preferences, something that we don't currently have the functions for in this class, something that you do not know how to calculate. So I have to give you a little bit more information. So we're going to assume that if you worked by yourself, you would pick 15 pounds of apples and 20 pounds of cherries. You kind of like them equally, so you're going to spend half your time picking one, half your time picking the other. Your neighbor is going to spend most of their time picking apples, so they're going to pick 14 pounds of apples, and some of their time spending picking cherries. They'll pick 4 pounds of cherries. The trade rate, this is going to be something that you and your neighbor negotiated. Presumably you would sit down and discuss how much you like apples, how much you like cherries, talk about the total you can each produce, and you'd come up with some trade rate. So you guys have worked together and you've decided that you should trade 15 pounds of apples for 25 pounds of cherries. So this information you cannot currently figure out on your own because you don't have access to the utility functions. What you did calculate, though, is the comparative advantage, and you figured out who should do what. So with trade, so specialization, you are picking 30 pounds of apples and 0 cherries. Your neighbor is picking 0 apples and 32 pounds of cherries. So specialization means you each only do one task. You've decided that your trade rate is going to be 15 pounds of apples for 25 pounds of cherries. So what that means is that you picked 30 apples and you're going to give half of them to your neighbor. And you're going to end up with 15 apples, and they're going to end up with 15 apples because you're trading now. And your neighbor is going to give you 25 pounds of cherries. Oops. So you're going to have 25 cherries, and they are going to have 7. You've each spent the same amount of time picking fruit as you did before when you were doing half of your time on apples and half cherries. Now you're just spending all of your time on apples. So you're still spending the same amount of time picking fruit. So what we can see is that when you did it by yourself, you ended up with 15 pounds of apples and 20 pounds of cherries. Now after specializing and trading, you still have 15 pounds of apples, but now you have 25 pounds of cherries. You have 5 extra pounds of fruit, and you did not have to spend any extra time doing anything. Same thing with your neighbor. They're not spending any extra time picking fruit, but they're focusing all of their time on cherries. Before, when they worked by themselves, they had 14 pounds of apples and 4 pounds of cherries. Now, after they've specialized and traded with you, they have 15 pounds of apples and 7 pounds of cherries. So they have more of both fruits than they did before. Both of you are spending the same amount of time that you did originally, but you now both have extra. You both have more fruit. You both have gotten to points on your production possibility curve that's beyond what you could have done before, a point that's otherwise unattainable. So specialization allows us to increase total production, but it's only useful if we're trading with other people who are also specializing. There's going to be net benefits from specialization and trade. We've got more apples, we have more cherries. So why are free trade agreements so controversial? Why do people get upset when there's lots of imports from other countries? I'm sure you've heard people talk about, hey, we should just buy everything that's domestically produced. Buy more stuff from America. Should we restrict trade? Are there some benefits to restricting trade? Well, there are winners and losers from free trade. So in the example we saw in this video, where you're working together with your neighbor, producing only apples and cherries, both of you actually benefit. You're both winners from that scenario. When we're looking on a global scale, though, you're not trading with every single individual person. And it's possible that what you're currently specializing in, you don't actually have a comparative advantage. And therefore, when markets are opened to free trade or globalization, you may lose that industry or lose that job. So oftentimes free trade leads to outsourcing or tariffs and quotas, things where we're trying to limit free trade because we don't like some of the results. For instance, if you are an apple producer and we open up to free trade and there's another country that produces apples more efficiently, all of a sudden the US apple market is no longer competitive and they might all go out of business. So the people who gain jobs, who gain income, are going to be the winners. People who lose their jobs or lose their industries are going to be losers from free trade. And then consumers in general in all the economies are going to benefit because there's going to be more available products without any additional work, meaning stuff is going to be cheaper and more abundant. There are also instances where we might want to restrict trade because we're trying to protect certain industries in our economy. For instance, national defense. It may not be a good idea to outsource all of your national defense. If another country is producing all of your weapons and military equipment and all of the things that you need to protect yourselves, if you have a political disagreement with that country or you go to war with them, you no longer have the ability to protect yourself against that country. Also, a lot of times countries try to protect infant industries. So maybe you want to start a new industry in your country or develop it, and there's no way they're going to be able to compete globally because the startup costs are high, the learning curve is high, and they're not going to be able to have a comparative advantage right away. Oftentimes governments will protect infant industries as a way to help them develop, help them to earn income and grow so that they are at a point where they can then have a comparative advantage around the world. So there are some benefits to restricting trade in certain industries or certain situations, but when we do open up to free trade, the more globalization we have, the more we're able to produce with our same amount of resources because we're taking advantage of the fact that people have different opportunity costs and countries have different comparative advantages, and so we can all benefit from each other. That is the end of this video.